Hello, and welcome to In Conversation with Bruce Kidd. I'm Heather Dichter. I'm an associate professor here at De Montfort University and a member of the International Center for Sports History and Culture. And I'd like to welcome you this evening to our In Conversation with Bruce Kidd event for DMU's Cultural Exchanges. It's always a pleasure to work with Cultural Exchanges, and I'd like to thank Nuala, Lauren, and David for their support in making this session possible, and our School for Humanities and Performing Arts colleague, Tony Graves, who oversees Cultural Exchanges. The International Center for Sports History and Culture is one of DMU's oldest specialist research centers, set up in 1996, and is still going strong as a unique center dedicated to researching, teaching, and public engagement on all aspects of sport history. We are thrilled to have Professor Bruce Kidd with us here tonight from Toronto. Bruce Kidd is a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education at the University of Toronto and the founding dean of that faculty. And I also have to admit that Bruce was also one of the committee members for my PhD at Toronto. Bruce has earned his own educational degrees from the University of Toronto, the University of Chicago, and York University, the one in Canada, not the one over here in the UK. Bruce teaches and writes about the history and political economy of Canadian and Olympic sport. And his most recent book was co-written with Simon Darnell and Russell Field, entitled The History and Politics of Sport for Development, that was published with Palgrave. And not surprising, as he has been heavily involved in sport development, particularly in the Commonwealth. Bruce's memoirs will be out later this year by the University of Toronto Press, and I know that I, for one, can't wait to get my hands on a copy of that book. Bruce has been involved in the Olympic movement throughout his life. He participated in the Games as an athlete in track and field in 1964, as a journalist in 1976, as a contributor to the arts and culture programs in 1976 and 1988, and as an accredited social scientist in 1988 and 2000. He served on the board for Toronto's 1996 and 2008 Olympic bids, and was deeply involved in the planning for the 2015 Pan American and Para-Pan American Games in Toronto. Bruce has worked with numerous local, national, and international bodies to advance opportunities for physical activity and sport. He has been a lifelong advocate of human rights and athletes' rights, including receiving honors from the Commonwealth and United Nations for that work. He's long been an advocate for gender equity, sexual diversity, ethnocultural diversity, and universal accessibility in sports. He is an advisor to the Indian sprinter Dudi Chand in her successful effort to overturn the 2011 sex test in international sport, and supports Caster Semenya's efforts to overturn the 2018 version of that test. He has been honored as an athlete with numerous Halls of Fame and with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Commonwealth Sports Awards Foundation, and he was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada. So we're very excited to have Bruce Kidd with us here today. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Heather, and thank you very much for this gracious invitation and the chance to see you again and have a conversation with you.
Oh, we're so happy to have you. So we'd like to go back to kind of the start of your career as an athlete. You won a gold medal and a bronze medal at the 1962 British Empire and Commonwealth Games in Perth, Australia, and then went on to compete in the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo. So we'd love to hear how you became an elite runner and what was it like competing at the Commonwealth and Olympic Games?
Well, in many ways, I lucked into athletics or track and field as a teenager. I played all manner of sports. My favorite was baseball. I also played a lot of hockey, and I lucked into running for my high school track team. And my high school coach steered me to Fred Foote of the East York Track Club, and Fred transformed my life. He was an Olympic coach. He had an ambition to help Canadian runners run on the world stage, and he transformed the lives of many young men and a few women through his genius as a coach. I would say that from that experience, I've always believed that if you only have one resource to invest in sport development, it would be a competent, ethical coach. You don't need facilities. You don't need a lot of money, but you need a coach. Fred lifted my ambitions. He helped me go from strength to strength. He accompanied me to all my early races, and really I owe it to him. I was inspired by the things I saw around. If I had more time, I could talk about some of the athletes that inspired me. But it was Fred Foote who inspired me the most and took me to the meets that you've mentioned and the other meets I ran in around the world.
Okay. And what was it like then competing at the Commonwealth Games and the Olympic Games?
You know, there's something very special about being among your peers and racing with them. I did very well in the Commonwealth Games. I did very poorly in the Olympics, but in both cases, there was this extraordinary sense of community. It wasn't always friendly. There were elbows and trash talking from time to time, but most people respected you as a member of that community, and that was very special. And in a way, you felt that you were running as much for them to show your very best as you were for your teammates, the people back in Canada, and so on. And that connection has always been very strong to me. I can't spend a lot of time talking about it, but I'm still in touch with some of the athletes that I raced against in different parts of the world in those years, and those bonds have proven very, very strong. Running at that level creates a tremendous sense of community with other people. There's nobody else crazy enough to do what you're doing, and there's nobody else who knows what it was to appreciate what you're doing.
Wow, that's so great that you still are in contact with some of those athletes you ran against. You've also been involved as an activist within sport, both as an athlete and as a scholar. So we wanted to know how and why you got involved as an athlete activist.
Well, that occurred over a period of years, but I gradually learned to ask questions and to represent people who were discriminated against or mistreated in sport. I grew up in a social democratic family, in a middle class community, and I was always encouraged to take responsibility for the activities that I was involved in. My parents made that point over and over again. You have the right to ask questions about what you're involved in. And when I got involved in track and field, it wasn't too long before I could see the ginormous double standard that Black athletes in the sport and women athletes in the sport faced. And it took me a while, and in some cases it took their pushing. But I gradually learned that in my position of privilege, I could sometimes raise questions in a more pointed way and intervene than they could, because they would only be further marginalized, if not kicked out of the sport altogether. And it wasn't hard growing up in the 50s and 60s to see the horrible racism that Black athletes encountered, the horrible sexism that my female track and field teammates encountered. I mean, no matter how inadequate our facilities, I think I never had to train without a dressing room and a hot shower. And that was 12 months a year, running outside. My female teammates all the time had to prepare, come to workouts, come dressed, or change in a car, or change behind a tree, and never enjoy that comfort of hot water. And it gradually became apparent to me that this was awful, and I gradually and tentatively began to raise my voice about some of these injustices. And, people encouraged me to do that. Sometimes it took a lot of courage. I had to screw up my courage to say things, and I learned to become more diplomatic. There was a period when people just thought I was a nutcase, or I was tactless. But I gradually learned to be an advocate for others. I had a background in political science. I had some experience in seeing how the development of appeals worked in other fields. So all of those came together to really steer me in this direction. But it started from parental encouragement that I should raise my voice against injustice, and an experience in track and field where I could just see there was a horrible double standard against some of my best friends.
Wow. So then what are you most proud of from your work as an activist? And then also, what issues are you working on at present? Because we know you're still an activist.
Well, I've worked since the early 60s on issues of athletes' rights, and in the course of my life, push governments and sports bodies to create a number of protections, policies, processes, tribunals, financial support to enable athletes to be treated, or at least to have a recourse to independent review when they felt they were not be treated fairly. I would say I'm most proud of my work with the anti-apartheid campaign against white apartheid South Africa during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Through a combination of circumstances, I became the Canadian director or coordinator of that program, and I spent a great deal of time and energy as an ally with the courageous leaders of the anti-apartheid campaign who came out of South Africa. So as an ally, throwing their snowballs, pushing Canadian governments and sports organizations to take steps to strengthen the moratorium against sports for the South Africa. And I'm proud to say there wasn't a Canadian sports minister or external affairs sports minister that I didn't write or personally go and see and push. And gradually we got Canada to be one of the countries to ban all sporting exchanges with South Africa. So I'm very, very proud of that role. I'm also proud of the allyship I provided to women and gender equity. And that was an outgrowth of the work I referred to on athletes' rights. Gradually, for a combination of reasons, I became an advisor to government, and then in my own university, the University of Toronto, a decision maker, and I was able to use some of those positions to advance gender equity. At the University of Toronto, almost 30 years ago, we created, and I was in the early years of my deanship then, or my leadership of academic physical education and athletics, we created a new regime where women's sports and men's sports were funded out of 2 equal envelopes. All facilities were created on an equal basis, where there were free sanitary products in all washrooms in the athletic facilities, where we made an aggressive campaign to hire women as coaches and leaders, and several other steps in that direction. Again, I didn't do it alone. It was where I was able to take advantage of opportunities my privilege provided to advance and put in place ideas and demands I got from others. And it was an extraordinary learning experience for me too, because I had patriarchal blinkers on, growing up as I did. But one by one, people helped me remove those blinkers and use my position to make change. I recount in my memoir one experience where during that gender equity investigation we did in the early 90s, we had the university's student safety officer come through the athletic facilities and give us her impression of it in terms of the safety and security of female students and athletes. These were facilities that I had comfortably spent my lifetime in, one of which I'd helped design and fund. And I was just shocked. I was just shocked by how frightening the women that I'd known found the design of these places. So that led to a complete redesign of that building, which is hard to do with concrete and steel. The recruitment of women to help design facilities, the development of women's only, as you'll remember from U of T, Heather, women's only hour in the weight room during prime time, women's only hours in the pool. And I was able to do that in my position of responsibility, but it was others who opened my eyes to that urgent need.
Great. And what issues are you working on at present as an activist?
Well, I'm primarily engaged in a pan-Canadian campaign, also international campaign to minimize and eradicate maltreatment and gender-based violence in sport, and in particular in Canada to create an independent mechanism to address that at the highest levels of Canadian sport, so that it can conduct education, it can provide counseling, and it can provide a form of administrative review of complaints that athletes and others bring forward. I'm also working with others, as you mentioned, to completely abolish the sex test in international sport, particularly in athletics, but also in football, because FIFA still has a gender verification policy on its books, which has led to the discrimination against, the expulsion from, the mistreatment of so many female athletes, particularly women from the global south, like Dati Chand, whom you mentioned, and Caster Semenya.
Now, you've also been quite involved in the Olympic movement as a whole, and particularly in Canada, and especially when Canada hosted the Olympics for the first time in 1976 in Montreal. So, could you talk with us about how you were involved with those Olympics, as not only the sports side, but also the related cultural events?
So the Montreal Olympics in 1976 should have been a great news story for Canadians in sport. I'd always dreamed of having an Olympics in my own country, but it was brought to Montreal on authoritarian auspices by the dictatorial mayor of Montreal, Mayor Drapeau. It was funded on the backs of social programs and the pollution of the St. Lawrence River, and against the wishes of most of its citizens. So how do you make the Olympics, which is one of my most precious beliefs, acceptable in a liberal democratic country? And I spent the 6 years prior to Montreal agonizing over that, working with activists in the city of Montreal to ensure that both the games went ahead and they were done on a better basis, an environmentally supportive basis, a community supportive basis. And most of Canada was divided into two camps: abolitionists who hated the Olympics or thought they shouldn't be in Canada and wanted the games removed from Canada, and and I would say holy rollers, or those who for whom the Olympics could do no wrong, and for whom it didn't matter at what social costs they wanted the Olympics. And I tried to forge middle ground in a formulation I developed called critical support for sport, so that we would argue for the Olympics, but not at all costs, in the context of social benefits too, and a democratic debate. And during those years, I took on a number of interventions. And the one you referred to in the visual and performing arts, initially Mayor Drapeau said there's no money for an arts and culture program. And I thought the history of arts and culture in the Olympics was really something to be continued and to be strengthened. And I saw the arts and culture program as a way of broadening the constituency within Canada for the Olympics, and to bridge the gulf between sports people and people in the arts that was so divisive in Canada at that time. I mean, sports people were publicly claiming that the arts community was getting too much money that they should have, and vice versa. And I thought that was nuts, because both were poor and needed the help of each other. So with others, I mounted a number of fascinating, rewarding interventions. I founded an organization called the Artists Athletes Coalition, bringing artists and athletes together to talk about what should be done and comparing experiences. And those were amazing events, because athletes and artists quickly found that they have way more in common than they have points of difference. And then gradually, because we needed to do some things to actualize this idea, put together a poster series of fine art posters, which were eventually mounted all over Montreal, copies given to athletes and coaches and members of the delegations, and sent around the world. And then I put on a play, or I shouldn't say put on a play. I recruited a theater company that developed plays with communities, marginal communities, as a way of affirming and drawing attention to their ways of life. That was Theatre Passe-Muraille in Toronto. Their signature play, The Farm Show, which, by the way, has been performed in England, probably in Leicester. The actors and director, Paul Thompson of Theatre Passe-Muraille, went into a rural farm community and spent the summer living and working alongside these farmers. And out of that, fashioned a play about their lives, their hopes, their disappointments, the politics they faced. And then they performed it for those very people in cattle barns and auction barns and community centers, and gradually took it around Canada and then around the world. And I wanted that for the athletes, and that's what we did. And we put on that play, first of all, in the Official Arts and Culture Festival in Montreal's Centaur Theatre, and then we took it to the Athletes Village and put it on in the Athletes Village, so the athletes of the world could see the lives and loves of Canadian athletes. It was such a high, I can tell you. And it also, I think, changed the expectation of what both arts and culture are about, and what the Olympics should be about.
Wow, that's so great to have brought those two worlds together. Because as you said, there's so many connections between sport and the arts. Now, you've also been involved with the Commonwealth Advisory Body on Sport. Now, this body isn't really that well known, but its work is quite important. So what did you do as a member? And then for the last few years during your membership, you were chair of this body as well.
So this body, Commonwealth Advisory Body on Sport, or KBOS for short, is the policy advice body of the Commonwealth Secretariat and Commonwealth governments, 54 governments around the world. And its responsibility is to advise those governments on the changing agenda in international sport, and what they should do in the face of the most serious challenges. And over the course of its almost 20-year existence, KBOS has advised on anti-doping, on match fixing, on the perplexing dilemma of autonomy in sport, whereby where sports bodies will take money for governments, but when they insist that those governments act, then those sports bodies act in accordance with government policy, they say, the autonomy of sport, you can't tell us what to do. A very, very difficult question in all Commonwealth countries, and particularly in the global South, where governments fund almost 100% of the sports body's expenses. And yet when governments say, maybe you should have democratic elections, they go running to the IOC, and the IOC beats up on them, or FIFA, and FIFA beats up on them because they've dared to ask these sports bodies to act in accordance with public policy. So KBOS has advised governments on a number of issues, but our most cherished topic is sport development and development through sport. How can governments assist and drive and recruit sport to the very difficult challenges of our time, particularly poverty, infant and maternal mortality, health, education, and so on. And KBOS has been, and this is what I spent most of my time on as chair, in developing model policies and simply persuading governments that they should think about sport not just in terms of getting a team to the Olympics and building stadia, but also using sport as a development tool, using sport to enhance inclusion, maternal health, education, and so on. We developed that mandate really at the height of the crisis, the pandemic of HIV/AIDS, when a number of amazing humanitarian physical educators in Africa were developing techniques to use sport to enhance preventive education about safe sex, and to combat stigmatization that was facing anybody with HIV/AIDS, and to encourage testing, which was a big problem in if there was so much stigma, you couldn't get people to test, and how could you conduct public health campaigns if you didn't know who was infected with the virus or not? And a number of African leaders led the way in showing us, and we in KBOS picked up those ideas and ran with them in all areas of development. And most recently, in the line with this, KBOS and the Commonwealth Secretariat has been working very closely with the other UN agencies to develop a coordinated approach to the development of sport, to enhance the sustainable development goals of the UN, and to monitor and evaluate with a common statistical framework what's working and what's not, so we can learn from these efforts. And it's slow bringing everybody on side. It's hard to fund sometimes because all the money goes to high performance sport. But whether it's the HIV AIDS crisis or the COVID crisis, you need broadly based sport as an important element of population health to give your entire population the resilience and well-being to withstand these challenges, or to help with that. And sport can play a role, and that's what KBOS does.
Great. So we've talked about a bit about your time as an athlete and your time as an activist and kind of sport leader. So we'd like to kind of turn to you as a scholar, and would like to know what aspects of sport and sport history have interested you the most, and why you've been drawn to those topics.
Well, I was first drawn to sports history because in my early activism and as a young athlete, I kept on finding out about historical precedents that I could have learned from if I'd known something about. I mean, when I was a young athlete, I read everything there was. I read the sports pages voraciously. I listened to every sportscast. I personally subscribed to every magazine I can. And I thought I knew everything there was about sport and sport history. But it was all about championships and athletes of the year and leading scores and all that kind of thing. And I kept on hearing about precedents that that would have been useful to me. So we talked a bit about Montreal. During the Montreal Olympic Games and all of the debates about whether they should be abolished or moved and so on, I had nothing to, I mean, we were all flying blind. And then in a footnote in one of in Richard Mandel's book on the Nazi Olympics, published in 1971, I read about the campaign against the 1936 Olympics and the idea of alternative Olympic Games. And that was, holy smokes, there was something going on that I knew nothing about. And so I jumped into trying to find out about that period. And I learned, oh my God, I learned that there was an anti-Olympic campaign in Canada, about which people I'd worked with, people who, like my chef de mission for the 1964 Olympic team, he was an athlete at that time, and I knew nothing about that. And that discovery led me to another. And I mean, you can't rewrite history, you can't bring it back, but it gives you a range of options. C. Wright Mills, Herbert Gutman, a number of these philosophical, sociological historians have set out the importance of history for shaping what you think about going ahead. And that's why I jumped into sports history. So I kept on, what today you've asked me, what is the most interesting part of sports history that I continue to think about? This is a huge generalization, but I'm most interested, and have been for some time, in the struggles for inclusion and meaning by those who were initially rejected or kept out of sport. I mean, modern sports as we know it in most countries of the world were developed as an upper class, white, masculine project, and everybody else was kept outside. But sport was so fascinating and so invigorating and so, under the right circumstances, beneficial, that those kept out wanted something for themselves. And to me, the most important narrative in sports history has been the struggle by those kept outside to find ways to engage in it for themselves under very different conditions, pursuing very different strategies. As you know, Heather, from your own work, sometimes they pursued their own distinctive organizations, and their own Olympic Games and their own clubs and their own newspapers. Sometimes they tried to climb the fence. Sometimes they pretended to be, white European males and get in that way. I mean, there are famous stories in Canada about Indigenous lacrosse players, when they were banned from playing lacrosse, growing mustaches because indigenous people were believed not to have been able to grow facial hair, and changing their names to masquerade as good Europeans to play lacrosse. And certainly in my lifetime in the facilities, well, at the University of Toronto, in the facilities that were closed to women, I know I helped a number of women athletes pass as men, wearing 1960s hoodies to pass as men to get access to facilities from which they were unfairly barred. So this is just a couple of snippets. There's a long arc to these stories, and they continue today. I mean, the struggles we talked about against the sex tests, the struggles against discrimination, the struggles to recognize, the black, the Negro baseball leagues in the United States. I'm sure there are others in the UK and Germany and other countries. These struggles are really important to continue to investigate, and so that people today know. I mean, when I talk about the media, I like to say that the symbolic landscape of sport presented by the media, which is largely, professional and male, constitutes 5% or less, or even much less of the lived experience of sport in all our societies. We need to tell the history of the 95%. And I'm still fascinated by those challenges.
Oh, that's great. And speaking of challenges, obviously the current Olympic focus right now is on the postponed Summer Olympics in Tokyo from last summer to this summer. But there's also been some concerns about the 2022 Winter Olympics, and as they'll take place in China, which has obviously been in the news a lot about its treatment of minority groups. Even today, CNN had a story about Michaela Schifrin saying that she doesn't want to have to choose between morality versus being able to do her job. So we wanted to hear about your thoughts on this situation with the 2022 games in China.
Well, thank you very much. Like Ms. Schifrin, I hope that athletes won't have to choose from expressing themselves and expressing their strong support of human rights and competing in those games. It's at the moment it's a very, very difficult, very difficult situation. And I hope there will be space somewhere created by the IOC and permitted by the Chinese government to allow the world of Olympic winter sports and Paralympic sports to come together under peaceful auspices, recognizing each other's differences, recognizing that one of the differences may be around human rights, and the Olympics should allow athletes to express their rights and for the games to go ahead. I'm really, really worried. I hope that in the Olympic tradition that Thomas Bach is pushing the diplomatic initiatives he can and trying to find that middle ground. But I worry, I worry that the Chinese are going to push back. What happened in 2008, as we know that the Chinese would not allow any advocacy of human rights, and Jacques Roga just knuckled under, and he and the NOCs beat up athletes who expressed those views. I mean, my longtime friend and colleague Dick Pound told Canadian athletes to shut up or go home. That can't happen in 2022, and there's got to be a space. I've put out several options. I think that the IOC has got to put in the ceremonial and affirmation of human rights. I think that the IOC has got to really guarantee that Rule 50 will be liberalized, that is in keeping with human rights, and that's still a big question mark. I think it would be. I mean, the worst nightmare for me would be to have a situation where you have athletes speaking out and being expelled. I mean, as a proud Olympian, the worst nightmare happened in 1968 when two athletes on the podium, an athlete and others in other ways, gave a strong endorsement of Black civil rights, and they were expelled from the Olympics. I mean, the IOC should not be expelling anybody who espouses the values of the Olympic movement. But we've got a year. I don't know how it's going to go. One of my colleagues, a retired Canadian diplomat, asked me the other day about whether or not athletes could compete under the Olympic flag. As athletes from some NOCs like Great Britain did in 1980, to show that they were not there representatives of governments, but they're representatives of the Olympic community in the spirit of the Olympics. The clock is ticking. We got to get Tokyo 2020 bracket NE out of the way. But I hope these discussions are going on in the most intense way, because it would be horrible. It would be horrible if the IOC had to cancel the Olympics, and it would be horrible if the Chinese canceled the Olympics. I mean, you've got to defer. I guess there are two reasons why I would like an accommodation with respect to China. It is now a superpower, and it is the most populous country in the world, and it should be part of the Olympic movement. And our history has been to work with all people and to discuss these differences in peaceful ways. There's got to be a way in which we can express these differences without the Chinese saying, we'll either throw you in jail or we won't have the Olympics. And there's got to be. I've spoken on human rights in China. I don't want to reveal although I'm sure they already know, I don't want to reveal my hosts. They were quite happy. They took a different point of view. They said, this is not our way, but they were open to hearing. They were curious about what I argued. I think that's but it's very different from doing that in a tiny, small setting and on the world stage. But I'd like to see that on the world stage so we don't have to go to these terrible fallback scenarios.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the Tokyo Games in your comments there, and obviously the pandemic has upended so much with sport. The Olympics being postponed for an unprecedented chance by a year. What do you see, even with the Olympics, but even more broadly beyond? What do you see as the biggest challenges for sport as a result of the pandemic? What can we do?
Well, big question. First is the safety and well-being of everybody in the world. And I would like to see the IOC working with the WHO, even after the vaccine has been delivered to first world countries, to follow up, whether it's under the banner of Sport for Development Peace or Olympic Aid or whatever, to ensure that every person in the world who'd like the vaccine would be able to have that. I think that's a challenge for all of sport, because you can't play sport if you're looking over your shoulder all the time and fearing this awful pandemic. Secondly, I think we've got to the pandemic has accentuated inequality in every form, but particularly in opportunities for healthy sport and physical activity. In all of the survey data that I've seen in the last 14 months, participation levels have gone down. It is true that in middle class communities and in around the world and in creative communities, people have come up with adaptations to enable people to be physically active. But for the most part, it's for all of these complicated reasons, it's reduced physical activity. And I think that we've got to give a priority. I mean, governments have privileged men's professional sport in getting back, but what they've not done is gone out of their way to look at who's still able to do healthy physical activity. I mean, in many countries like my own, well, governments have ensured that primary and secondary and tertiary education have continued with, this technology, StreamYard and other technologies. They've not been as concerned about physical education and physical activity, and that is a huge crisis. We've got to build back better, and we've got to build back better with an intersectional gender lens, because this inequality has also hit the poor, hit women, hit persons with disabilities, hit Black and Indigenous people heavier than it's hit anybody else. And I would like to see, under the banner of, one of the IOC's banners is sport for all, the fundamental right for all, to crank up its sport for development. The IOC invests the profits or the revenues from Olympics through international solidarity in many parts of the world, but that mostly goes to high performance sport. I think, I'm not sure how you do this because high performance sport has need, but there's got to be a way of steering more and more money to sport for development and sport for all with an intersectional gender lens.
No, it's really great to hear, thinking about these issues that are confronting sport more broadly. And it does lead us into some of the questions that our wonderful audience has submitted prior to our talk going live, and kind of drawing on from that, thinking about those challenges to sport, and coming back to one of your earlier experiences in sport is thinking about, what, especially as a result of the pandemic, what kind of challenges or risks or opportunities do you then think are confronting the Commonwealth Games and Commonwealth sport? Is any of the comments that you just said, pertain in a different way, or especially within the Commonwealth?
Well, the Commonwealth Games are scheduled to take place next year in Birmingham, and I guess they've got another year to adapt to these challenges. I would, and the CGF is, in my view, one of the good guys, although they have very, very, very few resources compared to the IOC. But they've been moving towards a gender equality agenda in a way that leads the world. So there are good things on the agenda for Birmingham. I would urge it with the Commonwealth Secretariat and with the UN in those countries to ensure that every country in the Commonwealth has the vaccine, by the end of this calendar year, so that sport preparation, sport activity continues to go on. And I don't know the logistics of that, but in keeping with what I said a few minutes ago, that is something that the Commonwealth ought to do. I would hope that I'd hope that in that every athlete coming to every athlete coming to Birmingham, by then is vaccinated and so on. And I guess what I would like to see is the Birmingham community and UK sport under the leadership of the Commonwealth Games think more about what your first world community can do to enhance sport in the impoverished community. These efforts have begun in the Commonwealth, as I've indicated. I believe the bid committee put up some money for Commonwealth sport development at one point, but they've got to be intensified, increased, and so on. In recent years, hosting games have been all about us. What can we get out of hosting the games? How can we use the money that's generated internationally to build better facilities for us, to create a marketing plan for our city, to enhance tourism and so on? And I mean, Canada was the worst. I hate to say, I'm embarrassed for the 2010 Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games, where they tried to create Canada Games. It was all about us. I think first world hosts of these games have to see themselves as both providing opportunities for the world community or the Commonwealth community, many of whose members come out of very different and impoverished and still suffering from the ravages of imperialism and colonialism, particularly for a British city, given the legacy of British colonialism. That kind of sport as reparation should be very much a conscious thing, but it's got to be about giving to all. We've got to break the association that staging the games is all about us.
Okay. We've got another question submitted from the audience. What would you say is an area of athletes' human rights that is the most at risk at present?
Boy, difficult question, and it probably varies from region to region. I mean, if we're talking about human rights generally, I would say genuine access to opportunities, which because of poverty and other conditions are not available to most people in most countries. If we're talking about athletes, that limited segment stratum of the population that's already in high performance sport, I guess I would say the right to train and compete without maltreatment, gender-based violence, without I mean both physical and psychological violence, with adequate conditions and so on, and the rights to raise complaints about this to an independent arbitrator where the athlete feels that they're mistreated. That basic right is available to most high performance athletes in the first world countries, like my own with the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada, but it's not available at all. I mean, Human Rights Watch issued a report on December 3rd or 4th of last year about the treatment of women in Africa and Asia. And what was so horrifying in that report, it was mostly about sexual abuse and the weapon of this, the way that the sex test has been weaponized against them. But those athletes had no right of appeal, and they continually faced reprisal. Those rights have got to be established across the board. And I think both the Commonwealth and the IOC have got to ensure that. The IOC has come up with a new plan. I just saw it this morning for the first time, Agenda 2020 plus 5. And one of their 15 recommendations is to strengthen athletes' rights. Let's hope that is actually realized. I mean, the whole history of athletes' rights has been a lot of promise and very little delivery.
Okay. And the last question from the audience, you have been an inspiration to so many. So if you were starting out now, who would be your inspiration?
Wow. There are so many athletes today that I admire for their athleticism and their advocacy. There's so many, and some of them bring tears to my eyes. The one that I'll mention today is a Canadian that everybody should know. Her name is Stephanie Nixon, and Stephanie is a distinguished Paralympian, and she will be the chef de mission for the Canadian Paralympic team in Tokyo. She was born with one leg, and she, with a lot of challenge and difficulty, and I cannot believe the hardship she faced, used sport to gain a sense of self and became a successful Olympian. And then her transition, and she became an advocate for persons with disabilities in such an eloquent and exceptional way. And what is, I will say two things about that. In the first place, she decided to throw away her artificial leg, her prosthesis, and walk with crutches. Although she's amazing, she can cycle and ski. She's one of the most gifted athletes you'll ever see. But to make the point that that we should recognize and respect and engage with people with disabilities as they are, not with all the aids. I'm still getting used to that idea, but her advocacy has been just so thought-provoking in the interests of a different version of advocacy. And then secondly, she's been a huge athlete right advocate, locker room lawyer. She's experienced or she's seen terrible abuse of athletes within the training regime. And in the interest of high performance sport, a number of athletes have been pushed to. She's a really good advocate against that, and she's a tremendous advocate for a humanitarian approach to training and competition. You don't have to be a total shit to be a good coach. And so look her up, download one of her op-eds. She's amazing. And oh boy, if I was thinking about being an athlete today, although she's not in a discipline that I love to swim, but I can't swim very fast, she still would be one who'd give me inspiration.
Oh, that's so great to hear. And we thank you so much, Bruce, for coming to us or joining us from Toronto today. It's been wonderful having this conversation with you. Again, thank you to Noah, Lauren, and David, everyone at Cultural Exchanges. We've had a great time today. If you've enjoyed what we at the International Center for Sport History and Culture supporting this talk and our other events, we do have a series of research webinars. Our next one is on March 16th, and we'd love to have everyone who has this interest in sport and history to come join us. So thank you again, Bruce, and thank you everyone for joining us today at our Cultural Exchanges event.
Thanks, Heather.